Oh. All right, so this section will go with 41.2 through 41.3, and it talks about species diversity and trophic structure. So we're going to get into the diversity of a community. So communities, remember, built up of many different populations of different species, and how those communities can become diverse. So many different species. While you don't find many environments that only have one species that dominate it, and we'll take a look at trophic structure and how the interactions of these different species in the community trying to fulfill their needs, gain energy, can influence the dynamics of that community. So first of all, we're going to talk about species diversity. So pretty much every community has more than one species. And the variety of different kinds of organisms in a community is defined as its species diversity. And it has two components. And why is that? Because what do we mean by diversity? We know a diverse anything has many different members of that group. But what exactly do we mean by diversity? How can we measure if a community is diverse or not? We use two different factors. And one is called the species richness, which is the number of different species in that community. So, for example, if a given community has 5 different species that live there, it has less species richness than a similar area that has 10 species. All right. So part of species diversity is species richness, and we also include that what's called relative abundance. So how many of each of those species are present. And because species diversity is a combination of those two factors, species diversity looks different from place to place. So, for example, in Community 1, we have 4 different species, A, B, C, D, and we have 25% of each. All right? But in Community 2, we have 5 different species, but we have 80% of species A, 5 of B, 5 of C, and 10 of D. Because we use both of these characteristics, species richness and relative abundance, we would say Community 1 is more diverse. They both have 4 different species, same species richness, but the relative abundance of each species in Community 1 is much higher than Community 2. So this would be higher diversity. And though you won't need to know it for the AP test, ecologists use quantitative measures to create what's called species diversity index. And one of the ones that they use is called the Shannon Diversity Index, which basically is a mathematical formula that takes into account both of these measures, relative abundance and species richness. So you won't need to be able to solve problems using this Shannon Diversity Index, but just know that it is a quantitative measure of species diversity, utilizing species richness and relative abundance. Why is having a diverse community important, though? So we just talked about it a lot of the times in the commercial about how we need to save the diversity of organisms on Earth, to save biodiversity. Why is that? Well, there's been a lot of studies done, and actually more diverse communities produce greater biomass than less diverse communities. So they have a higher dry mass of all the biotic matter per unit area. They also are more resistant to invasive species, so invasion by non-native species. They are reproductively more consistent, so the community will stay healthy and strong for longer. They're more productive, and they resist major environmental stressors like fire and drought and wind and snow, things like that. So, for example, here we have 3 different communities, one much more diverse than the other 2. And we can see that the community 1 has a high density of, let's say, blue species that do well in colder years, and one that has a high population of green species that do well in warmer years. And see, over time, what you'll notice is that a diverse community stays denser, it stays healthier, because it has a fair mix of both. So during warmer years, you'll see the green species kind of reproduce and dominate, become more abundant. Whereas during colder years, maybe the green species will die off more, but the blue species will fill out, become more abundant. So on average, it will stay healthy despite any of the stressors that are placed on it. So now we're going to kind of switch gears and talk about trophic structure, food webs, and food chains. And this kind of describes that interaction between organisms, the very basic level. At very basic level, organisms need food. They need an energy source, and usually each other, or plants, are the main energy source for many organisms. The trophic level of an organism is its position in the community relative to the flow of energy from producer to top carnivore. So, for example, we have our primary producers, which would be our first trophic level. They get energy directly from the sun. Our primary consumers, they consume or use up energy from the primary producers by eating them. So there are herbivores. They're trophic level 2. Trophic level 3 are secondary consumers. They eat those herbivores, those primary consumers. Trophic level 4 are tertiary consumers, eat those things like the mice and the smaller fish. And trophic level 5 are quaternary consumers. These are top carnivores, top of the food chain, orca whales, hawks, things like that. And so we can follow the flow of energy through the community from the sun to trophic level 1 all the way to top carnivore. And when we organize the species in a community like this, illustrating our flow of energy from sun to the top of the food chain, we call this a food chain. However, food chains are not isolated. In fact, many food chains that can be created for a community are linked together in reality into a large interconnected food web. So food webs like this illustrate kind of the more accurate flow of energy in an ecosystem by combining a whole bunch of food chains together. So energy flow isn't always linear, and an organism's trophic level isn't always consistent regardless of the context. So, for example, what we'll see here is that in the frog, we'll take the frog for example, the frog is a secondary consumer. It eats the grasshopper here, which is a primary consumer, but our frog is also a tertiary consumer. It eats the dragonfly, which is a secondary consumer. It eats the fruit fly, which is a primary consumer. It eats the mangoes, which are a producer. That's what I mean by its trophic level is not always consistent regardless of context. Really important though is changing a food web slightly can have severe repercussions farther or up or down the food web. So for example, if I take these grasshoppers out of here, our corn is going to increase in abundance, but our frogs and rats will start to decrease because they don't have any grasshoppers to eat, and that will affect the pythons, which will have to be, eat more wolves or starve or migrate, all right? That brings us to what's called dominant and keystone species. So dominant and keystone species are two types of species in a community that have a large impact or influence over the health and the structure of that community. So a dominant and a keystone species, both of these have special terms because they have a giant impact or influence over the health and the structure of a community. They're like the main players. A dominant species, for example, are the most abundant in a community or have the highest biomass. By sheer number, they are the most important because they take over that community. Most of the time, a dominant species might be a producer, might be a plant. However, a keystone species are not abundant in an environment, but are still have a large impact or influence because they have a pivotal ecological role. So maybe they're pivotal in the environment. For example, because they provide shelter for a lot of other organisms. Like many burrowing creatures are keystone species because they till up the soil and provide homes for a lot of other organisms. So dominant and keystone species both have large impacts over the health and structure of a community. And kind of the last thing we're going to talk about is disturbance and how disturbances shape a community. So communities respond to change. There are very few that are climax or at equilibrium that are just kind of non-changing. Communities are always changing, and one of the biggest mechanisms for change in a community is disturbance. So disturbances don't have to be necessarily fire, like forest fires or giant blizzards or droughts. Those are examples of severe disturbances. But they can just be like wind or increase in sunlight, things like that. Something that changes periodically. Through research, ecologists have recently found evidence of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which means that a community that is disturbed intermittently, not too rarely but not too often, and not too severely but not too lightly, has a higher diversity index than low or high disturbance communities. So these disturbances every so often are important for renewing the diversity of a given community. Changes in a community are most apparent after disturbances. So right after like a forest fire, it's most apparent that there are changes happening in the community. A community may be gradually replaced by other species, and then those species replaced by still other species, and those species replaced by others, kind of as the community is disturbed and it changes, new species take over, and this is called ecological succession. And succession is most obvious after severe disturbances like fires or storms or things like that. And there's really two types of succession. One, called primary succession, occurs like in a lifeless area where no soil has formed yet. So for example, a good example of primary succession is volcanic island. When a volcanic island first forms, there's just cooled rock, cooled magma, no dirt. And it takes hundreds of years, and first like lichens, some mosses start to grow and break down that rock into sand, and then as that those first colonizers, the moss and the lichen die, that organic matter becomes dirt, or becomes soil, and then new seeds are able to grow in that soil, and new plants and new organisms migrate, and that is primary succession. Secondary succession, on the other hand, occurs in areas where there is still a base layer of soil present. So soil, seeds and things that need soil can usually take place in secondary succession. And that's kind of depicted by this picture, both these pictures. So for example, after a fire, we just got the soil left, small shrubs will take over first, and then larger bushes and coniferous trees, very fire tolerant, shade intolerant, drought tolerant species, and then last, very shade tolerant, drought intolerant species like maples will take over. So kind of like we have here up top, we start at the bare rock, we get some lichens to break down the rock, some mosses to get the first soil, we get small annual plants and lichens, then as biomass, the soil profile builds up, we'll get perennial herbs and some grasslands. Over time we'll have some shrubs, some shade-intolerant trees like oak savannas, fire-tolerant, and then over a longer time we reach our climax community when we have shade-tolerant trees like maples and things like that. So, for example, here is another picture of kind of ecological succession in a forest, in a deciduous forest, and in a glacier, in a glacial community, from kind of the first mosses and lichens to spruces and western hemlock trees in a forest. And it, occurs over 200 years here after the glacial retreat. And so gradually, as the environment changes because of the species that were there before, new species come and become dominant and change the face of the environment. That's ecological succession. That's it for me today. If you have any questions, just let me know.